3 years after he vanished, the ghost of my husband returned, not with an apology, but with a blueprint to destroy my life. He left cash scattered on the floor and a terrifying ultimatum: sign the document or watch my world collapse. The silence in the house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It used to be filled with the clumsy thud of his boots on the hardwood floor, the off-key humming he did while making coffee, the sharp, sudden laugh that always made me spill whatever I was drinking. Now it was just the slow, agonizing tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of my new, hollow existence. It had been 3 years since Daniel walked out, 3 years since the note, small and stark white against the dark oak of the kitchen table. It wasn't a dramatic "we need to talk" letter. It was just 3 lines, scrawled in that precise, almost architectural handwriting he had. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. Don't look for me. Don't look for him." As if I had a choice. The first year was a blur of frantic phone calls, desperate drives to places we'd only ever dreamed of visiting, and waking up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd imagined the entire thing. The second year was legal work, selling the house we'd poured every spare penny into renovating, closing joint accounts, officially declaring him absent. People tried to help. My sister Sarah moved in for 6 months, bringing casseroles and tough love, trying to convince me that Daniel was a ghost and I needed to exhume myself. But how do you let go of the blueprint of your future? We had plans. We had the nursery painted a pale, hopeful yellow, even though we were only trying to conceive. That room became my shrine, the place I went to scream into pillows until my throat burned. The third year, the silence settled in. I was functional. I kept my job as a graphic designer, taking on more freelance work because the steady paycheck was the only tangible thing left holding my reality together. I learned to make coffee for one, to eat dinner watching the news, to navigate the world with the ghost of his hand in the small of my back. I stopped looking at the door every time a car slowed down outside. I stopped expecting that familiar jingle of keys in the lock. I had built a fortress of routine around the gaping hole he left, brick by painful brick. The biggest hit hadn't been the money. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. It was the reputation. Daniel was a respected architect. He didn't just leave me, he left his firm mid-project, mid-life. Rumors flew like angry wasps. Was he in debt? Was he running from the mob? My name was still whispered in the same circles, but now it was laced with pity or suspicion. I maintained a steely composure, claiming ignorance, but internally, I was unraveling daily under the weight of what people didn't say. Last month, I finally packed away the pale yellow crib. It felt like admitting defeat, like laying a wreath on a grave I wasn't sure existed. I'd even started dating again. A kind, slightly dull accountant named Mark who never asked too many questions and always brought flowers that wilted too quickly. It was safe, predictable. Everything Daniel wasn't. It was a Tuesday evening about 7 o'clock. I was on my balcony, nursing a glass of cheap Merlot and sketching out a logo for a new organic juice company. The city lights were beginning to bloom below, a familiar, indifferent tapestry. The air was cool, carrying the scent of distant rain. I remember pausing my charcoal stroke, stretching my neck, when I heard it. It wasn't the usual city noise. No sirens, no bass thumping from the apartment below. It was a distinct, sharp sound from the street directly below my 4th-floor balcony. A sound I hadn't heard in 3 years. A sound so intrinsically linked to the man who abandoned me that my heart seized in my chest, halting my breath mid-inhalation. It was the low, distinct rumble of his vintage motorcycle engine. The old Triumph Bonneville he swore he'd never sell, the one he'd been restoring the year we met. I froze, the charcoal stick clattering onto the wooden deck. I told myself it was impossible. He'd sold it, right? He had to have sold it to finance his escape. I crept to the railing, pressing myself against the cold metal, peering down into the shadowy street lined with parked cars. And there it was, gleaming under the amber glow of the street lamp, impossibly beautiful and utterly familiar, the bike. And standing beside it, running a gloved hand over the worn leather seat, was a man. Taller than I remembered, perhaps, heavier in the shoulders, but the way he moved, the set of his jaw, it was him, Daniel. He looked up then, right toward my balcony, even though it was dark up here. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face older, harder, etched with lines I hadn't put there, but unmistakably him. And he started walking toward the entrance to my building. My first instinct wasn't relief or anger. It was pure, physiological terror. My entire body locked down, rooted to the spot. The wine glass slipped from my numb fingers, shattering on the deck with a sound that felt deafeningly loud in the sudden quiet. I didn't even flinch at the mess. My eyes were fixed on the lobby entrance below, watching the way he pushed the heavy glass door open, the way he moved with an almost predatory grace that I had once mistaken for charm. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look nervous or remorseful. He looked like a man returning to claim property he'd temporarily misplaced. I scrambled back from the railing, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. No, not here. Not now. I had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being fine, composed, the woman who survived being discarded. I couldn't let him see me shattered, not after all this time. He didn't deserve to see the damage he'd inflicted. I raced back into the apartment, my bare feet slapping against the polished floorboards. The apartment felt suddenly enormous, exposed. I fumbled for my phone on the counter, my hands slick with sweat, my mind screaming through 1,000 panicked scenarios. Should I call the police? What crime had he committed? Desertion? That's not exactly grounds for an intervention. Should I call Sarah? Tell her the ghost had materialized? As I unlocked the phone, I heard the elevator ding down the hall. He hadn't even bothered with the stairs. He took the lift. That meant he was coming directly to my floor. I dove into the living room, grabbing the first thing that looked vaguely defensive, a heavy cast-iron bookend shaped like a miniature gargoyle. Pathetic, but it was all I had. I glanced wildly around the room, seeking refuge, a hiding place. There was nowhere. This was our space, meticulously curated over the years to reflect a life that had continued, a life he had no right to interrupt. I darted to the front door, peering through the fisheye lens. I could see the hallway carpet, the beige wall opposite. Nothing. Silence again. But this silence was different. It was the charged silence before an explosion. Then I heard the muffled sound of movement just outside my door. Not a tentative knock, but the firm press of a hand against the wood, perhaps testing the handle. My breath hitched. I held the gargoyle tight, bracing myself. If he tried to barge in, I would throw whatever I had at him. The lock didn't turn. He didn't have a key anymore, of course. We'd changed the deadbolt immediately after he left. A moment passed, agonizingly slow. I closed my eyes, preparing for the inevitable battering of the door. Then a sound came through the wood, a voice. It was deeper than I remembered, roughened at the edges, but undeniably his. "Clara," he called, his voice low, carrying just enough to vibrate through the door panel. It wasn't demanding. It was almost weary. "Clara, please. I know you're in there. Just talk to me." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I fought them back. "Talk to you? After 3 years of silence?" "Go away, Daniel," I managed to rasp out, my voice barely a squeak. I leaned my head against the cool wood, trying to project strength I didn't feel. "You forfeited that right." There was a soft sigh from the other side, the sound of a man defeated before the battle had begun. I allowed myself a small surge of triumph. He's leaving. But the moment of victory dissolved instantly. Instead of footsteps retreating towards the elevator, I heard a distinct metallic click. He hadn't tried the lock again. He was doing something else. I cautiously pressed my ear back against the door, straining to hear over the pounding in my own ears. I heard a faint scraping sound, followed by a very specific, gentle thud on the welcome mat. I held my breath, waiting for him to speak again, waiting for him to give up. But he didn't. The only sound now was the fading hum of the elevator as it presumably started its journey back down. He was gone. He hadn't tried to force entry. He hadn't begged. He had simply left something. Slowly, tentatively, I unlatched the deadbolt and cracked the door open just an inch. My eyes darted down to the mat. There was no note, no flowers, just a single very old object lying there, glinting dully in the dim hallway light. It was the silver locket I had lost when I was 16, the one my grandmother had given me. I hadn't seen it since the day I met Daniel, convinced I'd dropped it somewhere years before we even moved in together. How had he known where it was? And how had he gotten it back? My fingers trembled as I reached for the locket. It was cold, heavy, and undeniably real. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random object dropped by a passing stranger. This locket had been missing for over a decade. The only time I'd even mentioned it recently was 6 months ago, during a horribly awkward dinner with Mark, when I'd mused aloud that I wished I still had it. Daniel must have been there. He must have been watching, listening, somehow tracking my life from the shadows for years. The realization hit me with the force of physical impact. He hadn't just vanished. He'd been monitoring. I snatched the locket, slamming the door shut and throwing the deadbolt home with more force than necessary. My hands shook so violently I could barely fit the key into the secondary lock. I leaned against the door, sliding down until I was sitting on the cold floor, clutching the silver heart against my chest. The locket didn't just mean something sentimental, it was a tether to a version of myself I thought I'd buried with my old life. Daniel knew that. He knew exactly which nerve ending to prod. I forced myself to stand, pacing the small perimeter of the living room. I had to get rid of the motorcycle. I had to change my number. I had to move. The illusion of safety I had painstakingly constructed around my solitary life had just been pulverized by one silent gesture from a man who should have remained history. I needed proof of how he got the locket. I needed to know if he was still nearby. I crept back to the front door, my heart settling into a grim, determined rhythm instead of panicked fluttering. I pressed my eye back to the peephole, scanning the empty hallway. Nothing but the beige carpet stretching toward the elevators. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I cracked the door open again, this time only a sliver, peeking out. The hallway was silent. He was gone. But if he was gone, how did he get the locket? I cautiously stepped out, my senses on high alert, listening for the mechanical whir of the elevator or the distant rumble of the motorcycle. The coast seemed clear. I quickly glanced over the edge of the stairwell opening, empty. Satisfied he was out of sight for the moment, I moved quickly toward the elevator bank, peering down the shaft. The lights were dark. The indicator panel showed the car was parked on the ground floor. He had left, but he hadn't been in a hurry. I turned to go back inside, about to retreat into the sanctuary of my apartment, when I noticed something tucked into the seam between the elevator doors on my floor. It was thin, folded precisely, tucked in so carefully that only someone actively looking for it would spot it. It was a single sheet of high-quality, creamy cardstock, the kind used for formal invitations or high-end architectural renderings. My stomach tightened. I knew that paper. It was the signature stock Daniel always insisted on for his personal correspondence. My hands felt heavy as I pulled the folded paper free. It didn't rattle. It was thick, suggesting only one thing lay within. I retreated 2 steps back toward my own door, feeling like a trespasser in my own building, and unfolded the card. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't an apology. It was a photograph. It was a picture of me. Not a grainy surveillance shot, not a blurry snapshot from a distance. It was a professional, studio-quality photograph of me, taken perhaps 6 months ago, sitting at my desk, deeply engrossed in work, a faint, contented smile playing on my lips. I recognized the lighting. It was the soft, natural glow from the large window in my home office. And tucked into the bottom corner of the photo, written in that precise, infuriating handwriting, were 2 words that made the blood drain from my face. Soon. Tomorrow. Soon. Tomorrow. The words echoed in the suddenly suffocating quiet of the hallway. The faint scent of expensive leather and something vaguely metallic, motor oil and cologne, still lingered in the air where he had stood moments before. He hadn't just watched me. He had orchestrated a private, staged encounter on my doorstep, leaving me with a chilling promise and a photograph that felt like a violation. I backed into my apartment, slamming the door again, heedless of the noise. I leaned my weight against the solid wood, staring at the photo in my hand as if it might spontaneously combust. How could he be so bold, so arrogant? After 3 years of ghosting me, he was now declaring his impending return as if he were announcing an appointment. The Mark situation flashed through my mind. The kind, dull accountant who was supposed to be my distraction, my safe harbor. Where was he now? Probably at his apartment, oblivious. If Daniel intended to show up tomorrow, I couldn't be here alone, weak and cornered. I rushed to the kitchen island, tossing the photograph and the locket onto the marble countertop. I needed Sarah. She was the only person who knew the full extent of Daniel's capacity for manipulation, the only one who wouldn't dismiss this as paranoia. I grabbed my phone, stabbing at Sarah's contact. It rang twice before she answered, her voice bright and slightly rushed. "Hey, Clara, what's up? I'm just about to head to the gym." "Sarah, it's Daniel," I managed, the name tasting like ash. "He was here. He just left." There was a beat of complete silence on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What? Are you serious? Where? Did he say anything?" I recounted the scene quickly. The motorcycle, the quiet departure, the locket, and finally, the photograph and the note. I tried to keep the panic out of my voice, but I knew I was failing when Sarah's tone sharpened into protective steel. "He's threatening you, Clara. That's harassment. Did you call the police?" "No, I didn't have time. He left that thing at the elevator. He said he'd be back tomorrow." I looked at the photo again, the image of my own face staring back, serene and unsuspecting. "He took professional photos of me, Sarah. He's not just back, he's obsessed." "Okay, listen to me. You are not staying there tonight," Sarah commanded. "Get a bag, grab the essentials, and come to my place. I'll meet you halfway if I have to. We can call the police from there, file a report about the surveillance." The logic was sound. The suggestion, a lifeline. I nodded to myself, already moving toward the bedroom. "Yes, okay, I'm grabbing my laptop and my passport. Give me 20 minutes. I threw my passport, keys, and a few changes of clothes into a duffel bag. As I wrestled with the zipper, my eyes landed on the bedside table where I kept my small jewelry box. I hesitated, then opened it. All my everyday things were there. My grandmother's watch, a simple pearl necklace, my engagement ring. Wait, my engagement ring. It wasn't just gone. The small velvet cushion it usually sat upon was empty. I remembered Daniel insisting on taking it 3 years ago, claiming he would have it professionally cleaned and resized for a surprise renewal of vows ceremony when he found himself. I had cried, begged him not to take it, but he'd been insistent, promising he'd return it within a month. That was 3 years, 4 months, and 22 days ago. I sank onto the edge of the bed, gripping the empty velvet. He hadn't just left the locket. He hadn't just taken a photo. He had returned to reclaim the one tangible piece of our broken commitment he'd held hostage, the symbol of the future he'd stolen, and he'd left it somewhere for me to find now. He was using our past as a weapon to force me into his present. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah checking in. "Clara, where are you?" "Almost there," I lied, my voice tight. I quickly shoved the empty ring cushion into the duffel bag. I needed to get out, now. I swung the bag onto my shoulder, took one last terrified look around the apartment that suddenly felt like a trap, and hurried to the front door. I peered through the peephole once more. The hallway was still deserted. I unlocked the deadbolt, threw the door wide, and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind me, ready to sprint for the elevator. As I turned to face the corridor, I saw it. Right outside my door, blocking the path to the elevator, was a tall, dark canvas easel, the kind used by street artists or gallery painters. It was positioned deliberately, angled so that I couldn't walk past it toward the stairs without seeing it. On the easel, illuminated starkly by the harsh overhead hallway light, was a freshly painted portrait. It wasn't a photograph. It was a hyper-realistic oil painting of me, asleep in my bed, taken from an intimate angle I couldn't place, my face peaceful, vulnerable, and completely exposed. and directly beneath the painting, propped against the easel's leg, sat a small, worn leather satchel, the one Daniel always used for his drafting tools. I hadn't been alone in the apartment. He hadn't left minutes ago. He had been here while I was on the phone with Sarah. He had painted me while I was gathering my escape plan, all while I was staring at the spot where he'd left the locket. He must have hidden in the storage closet, or maybe he'd never even left the apartment at all, slipping out only to place the note by the elevator, knowing I'd find it first. The satchel looked heavy. I swallowed hard, realizing that if he was hiding in my apartment, he could still be hiding now. I took a hesitant step toward the easel, needing to know if the satchel was empty or if it held something far worse than a painting. I reached out a trembling hand toward the leather flap, just as the painting on the easel seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, the painted eyes appearing to follow my movement. My fingers brushed the cold, aged leather of the satchel. The texture was instantly familiar, grounding me for a split second in the normalcy of our shared past, before the terror snapped back into focus. If he was here now, hiding while I spoke to Sarah, he wasn't just watching. He was waiting for me to leave. He wanted the chase to end on his terms. I yanked the flap of the satchel open, preparing to find a weapon, a note, or worse, a key to the deadbolt. It wasn't any of those things. Inside, nested against a roll of blueprint paper, was a small, heavy velvet box. The same box that held my engagement ring. My heart hammered against my ribs, a violent, uneven rhythm. I snatched the box out. It was heavier than it should be. I flipped the clasp with a desperate click. The box was filled, but not with the diamond I remembered. Instead, nestled on the blue satin lining were a stack of crisp, new $100 bills, neatly bundled with a silver paperclip, and tucked beside the money, positioned precisely where the ring should have been, was a single, rolled-up architectural drawing, tied with a thin black ribbon. I dropped the box. The money scattered silently across the beige carpet, mingling with the bills I hadn't seen earlier, the ones I assumed were from Daniel's earlier deliveries. The sight of the cash was almost more insulting than the painting. He hadn't come for reconciliation, he'd come to buy me off. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. Daniel hadn't returned for forgiveness. He'd returned because he needed something from me, and he was trying to clear the slate first, settling old debts, the emotional ones he valued, symbolized by the locket and the ring money, before making his real demand. I ignored the cash, focusing only on the drawing. I snatched it up, my breath catching as I unrolled the heavy paper. It wasn't a floor plan or a structural diagram. It was a detailed, complex rendering of the entire city block where my building stood. And marked clearly in heavy red ink was the foundation of my building, highlighted with aggressive cross-hatching. Beside the drawing in the corner margin was a set of precise calculations concerning load-bearing stress and seismic vulnerability. I understood architecture, but I wasn't a structural engineer, yet the message was chillingly clear. I know how to bring this place down. Suddenly, the silence in the hallway felt hostile, expectant. I spun around, my eyes darting wildly from the painting to the elevator. He wasn't hiding in my apartment. He had been hiding out here, staging this entire scene. He had likely been watching from the stairwell, waiting for me to find the drawing and react. As if summoned by my realization, the elevator doors on my floor slid open with a soft, polite ding. Daniel stood there, impeccably dressed, holding his helmet under one arm. He looked calm, the weariness from moments ago replaced by a chilling confidence. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes held a dark triumph. "I knew you'd look at the drawing first, Clara," he said, his voice resonating softly in the confined hallway. He took a slow, measured step out of the elevator. "I didn't come back for forgiveness. Forgiveness is cheap. I came back because the city is about to pass that new zoning regulation next week, and I need your signature on this revised easement agreement before then. It's the only way to secure the historical designation for the old waterfront parcel, the one I've been working on for the last 3 years." He paused, gesturing toward the scattered money and the abandoned drawing. "The cash is severance for the distress. The locket is a peace offering. The painting, well, that's for me to keep. Now, sign the easement, and we can both walk away clean. I have the notary waiting downstairs. Say yes, and you get your life back, untouched." I stared from the menacing drawing to the man who held my old life hostage. He had meticulously planned this return, not as a lost lover, but as a highly efficient, deeply dangerous business associate. "And if I don't sign?" I asked, my voice steadying as a cold wave of clarity washed over my fear. The terror was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective anger for the life I had salvaged. Daniel let his gaze drift over the scattered $100 bills on the floor, then back up to the painting of my sleeping face. "Then, Clara," he said softly, tilting his head, "I have to start demonstrating exactly what happens when you refuse to cooperate with an architect who understands structural integrity.